I'm terribly excited about the subject of today. The keyword that we're discussing is River Elegy. River Elegy is a polemical 6-part television documentary that first aired on CCTV, China Central Television, in June 1988. The series was made by Wang Lushang and Su Xiaokang. And it argues that China needs to break with most of its, or much of its civilizational tradition, and needs to fully embrace industrial capitalist modernity. Now, it stands in a broader tradition, a wider tradition of scathing cultural self-criticism. And this is perhaps a part of China that is not so well known, especially to Westerners. The China that's not chauvinistic, the China that is not beating its chest, a China that is deeply, deeply self-critical. Now, so it provides. River Elegy is very interesting in its own right, and as interesting as a historical phenomenon. But in addition, it provides an access point to this tradition of scathing cultural self-criticism. Now, in order to get just as very briefly to get how radical and significant this this tradition of cultural self-criticism in China is, just to give you a little bit of a sense of how radical it is. Compare to the United States. If you talk to Americans, it's very easy to get Americans to criticize their government, right? So they will do it. They will do it on their own initiative. As a European, if I talk to Americans, they will bombard me with criticisms of the American government, often of a very suspicious nature, and sometimes venturing into conspiracy theories. So the last few days I've spent arguing with some people that in my understanding, it's probably not so likely that the Secret Service purposefully allowed Donald Trump to be shot. Just to give you one example, but when I first went to Berkeley as an exchange student in 2006, my first America experience, one of the first things that was told to me by a young scholar was that there was an island just off the coast of California, and the American government was creating viruses with which they wanted to infect the American population. So there's a lot of suspicion towards the government in American political culture. However, what you never hear is Americans saying something like, our cultural tradition, the tradition of our ancestors, are fundamentally misguided and holding us back. The American Constitution, the spirit of the American Constitution, the spirit of American democracy, are all things that are holding us back and outdated, and we need to look to the outside world for guidance, and we need to take the culture, the spirit, the overall societal framework of another society, bring it to our society, and use it to erase and override our cultural traditions with. This is something I've never heard a single American say. But you will hear something to that extent sometimes in China. And River Elegy is an example of such radical cultural self-criticism with which a lot of Westerners will be unfamiliar. With that, I'm going to turn to our guest for today, David Moser. David is difficult to introduce David because he has a very wide-ranging career. He spent most of his time in Beijing, in China, since the 80s. He was there in 1988 when River Elegy aired, and he was at Peking University in his dorm room. And Peking University is one of those hotspots for the discussion in the wake of River Elegy, which it caused a stir and in political and intellectual life in China. Now, David is an academic. He's a linguist. He has been very active in the media in China. He's been appearing on Chinese television programs for decades. He has been in various media projects. He's been on podcasts. He now still has a new podcast, Barbarians at the Gate. He's a jazz musician. He used to do comedy on Chinese television. It's a while ago, but you were in some comedy sketches. And And I think David's overall mission is to connect, to build cultural bridges and educational bridges in between China and the United States. And he's also an educational organizer, so public intellectual educational organizer, academic. It's very wide ranging, and it's a good combination. Particularly for this topic, because not only was David there when River Elegy came out, River Elegy is, of course, a media product, and it was widely discussed in academia. So the worlds of academia and media are deeply involved here. And with that, David, I turn to you, and I will first just ask generally, what is River Elegy about?
Okay, thank you for that, and thank you for the kind words. You laid a good groundwork there. It's a critique of Chinese culture, but we have to go back a little bit to the historical background of the 1980s that comes on the heels of what the Chinese call a century of humiliation. And China was opening up to the outside world. The nation was deeply aware that it was playing catch up with all the industrialized nations, and that despite its past times of glory and dominance, there was a painful realization that China had fallen far behind the West. So the purpose of this documentary was to simply ask, why did this happen? But the method used was not to, the method was to diagnose these long-standing problems at the core of Chinese tradition, to sort of put Chinese culture on the couch, so to speak, and examine why China had fallen so far behind. And the uncomfortable core message was that the Western powers were not the only cause, or maybe not even the main cause of China's backwardness, despite this century of humiliation rhetoric, but that the problem was Chinese culture itself, a painful subject to grapple with on mainstream TV. But they did. It's a very unorthodox documentary. It doesn't deal with historical chronologies or PowerPoint analysis, but rather it uses or borrows various metaphors, historical slogans, images, semiotic tropes, and even music to create a kind of a multidimensional piece of very polemical art that works at many different levels. The idea being to sort of activate intuitions and associations of the audience about the plight of the country, because people were, in fact, very aware of some of these problems. It was also very shocking, a sort of, almost sacrilegious reinterpreting and reimagining of the various precious cultural icons. It talks about the dragon should not be considered a symbol of powerful imposition or powerful governance, but rather a symbol of tyranny, cruelty, and aggression. And that the Great Wall was no longer a symbol of nobility, of China's greatness, but is now a symbol of just isolation, defensiveness, and insecurity. So imagine how that goes over with the Chinese public, sort of like what you were just alluding to, Americans being told that, our Constitution needs to be scrapped or something like that, or that the Washington Monument is a symbol of, racism or something like that. In fact, there's even a quote in the documentary. Says, "Oh, Great Wall, why do we still admire you?" So this is quite a sacrilegious, I would say, documentary. The structure of it is kind of in these dyads, a yin-yang type of analysis. So you have the Yellow River, China, and then the opposite of the blue oceans, the West. Tradition versus modernity. What else? Despotism versus democracy, cyclic history versus linear history, openness versus being closed off, and so forth. So the structure of the documentary touches on all these things, but it's not in a very analytical way. It's more in an intuitive way. when I watched it in my dorm room, I was struck by the fact that it was such an odd specimen, a documentary sort of fossil that didn't have any lineage. There was never anything at all like it on Chinese TV. It was still in the same sort of schlocky, staid, preachy CCTV style, but the content was more like the Passion of Lu Xun. So a very, very strange documentary. And also, it was also, let's not forget, it was very obviously an advertisement for Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms. That was very clear from the documentary, because there had been controversy and some trepidation about the economic policies because there had been inflation and lots of corruption that the people were aware of. So the documentary was serving many purposes, but mostly to challenge the notion of Chinese culture and moving forward to modernity and openness to the outside world.
Yeah, there's a whole list of things that are happening in this documentary. It's very hard I was trying to turf all the visual metaphors and all the juxtapositions and contrasts, but it was very hard to. I quickly gave up because there was so much going on. It was, as you said, it's openness versus China is closed, but it needs to open up as the reform movement of Deng Xiaoping has been doing, but it needs to be much more. We need to go much further with that. And then you have the open ocean. The ocean stands for openness, and the river, the Yellow River, stands for the old tradition, and it's clogged up. It perhaps the river worked a little bit previously, but now it's clogged up because it's been taking all the sediments from the Luz Plateau in western central China that color the Yellow River yellow, and it clogged. The river is now clogged up, and it's deaf, and nothing will come from it. And China needs to fully abandon its cultural tradition, its Confucianism, its feudalism, it's Maoism as well, by implication, and leave all this closed offness, leave the river, go into the ocean, and then the ocean stands for freedom, modernity, democracy, rationality, science, industry, wealth, new innovations, creativity, but it's also what previously threatened China because China closed off, so it became a river society, and then it couldn't develop further, and it was threatened when the West, with its colonial might in modernity, came from the oceans to China, and China wasn't ready for the oceans, but now it needs to get ready for the oceans. The ocean is hard, but you need to get into that ocean because otherwise you're not in the future. You're not in the global world. You're not there. And there's so much going on with visuals, with the airplane taking off, and it's a very, very wild documentary series. A
semiotic feast, you could say. I think some people said it was almost like Chinese poetry because instead of just coming out and saying exactly what they meant, they use images to evoke the truth that they're getting at. It was almost structured like a Tang Dynasty poem.
Yeah, it's a remarkable document and artwork. So you were there. You were looking at it in your dorm room, and you quickly find out it's not just an interesting, curious artwork. It's really has an impact. And you wrote a few years later, in 2011, or a few years ago, in 2011, you wrote in a longer blog style post. You wrote that it hit academic circles like a nuclear bomb. Could you walk us through this nuclear bomb impacting the social life around you?
Yeah, it sure was. So just as Deng Xiaoping had opened up and sanctioned people's creativity to create markets and wealth, this documentary opened up the academic world in a similar way to go ahead and enter into a full-throated conversation about the deep-seated flaws in Chinese culture and where China should move forward to the future. So they almost in parallel, that economic opening sort of also signaled an openness in academia as well. So as amazing as it is to think of this very shocking critique of traditional Chinese culture, and as you say, including Chairman Mao, you would have thought that there would be no way this would make it onto the television screen. But in fact, astonishingly, Renmin Ribao, the People's Daily, was publishing scripts of this film, of this documentary, in June, just after it aired, and so that people were not only watching it, but they were reading the script. They say that more than 200 million people viewed it. So obviously the ordinary people were being galvanized by these images and these statements, and it was shown twice, believe it or not. Once in June of '88, and then again in August, although with some censorship after the brouhaha of the first one. You should be remembered that some of the reason this was happening is that the party was split into hardliners and the reformers, and Zhao Ziyang, who was really Deng Xiaoping's right-hand man in the in the economic reforms, was actually shielding this documentary from outright censorship, because in fact it was felt, the purpose of it was to be a kind of advertisement for the economic reforms. And if you watch the documentary, Zhao Ziyang is sort of a hero of the documentary. There's many scenes with him in it as being the representative of this new way of thinking. So how did it hit academia? So I was on the campus of Peking University. And of course, my Peking University buddies that I was working with were very acutely aware that they were, the legacy of Beida was in their blood. These were Beida Peking University students. And May 4th is almost inseparable from the concept of Peking University. So what happened, and this was amazing to me because I had always known that China was so closed off and censored, but suddenly all over Peking University and all over the city were these things they called shalong, which is the Chinese transliteration for salons, meaning these sort of, what would you call it, meetings where people discuss a certain topic. And there were these salons all over campus on the themes of River Elegy. There were notices tacked up on the bulletin boards. There used to be a place at Peking University called the Sanjiaodi, the triangle square, if you want to put it that way, where they would put up notices of events. And I would walk by there and there would be, here's a shalom on the topic of something like, should China move away from one-party rule? Or is democracy possible under socialism, and so on and so forth. So some of these were just informal discussions in dorm rooms, but others were, in auditoriums with hundreds of students. And I think the exciting thing of that time was that for the first time, these students were feeling a sense of agency. They really felt like they could make a difference, that the historical moment was there. And also because the discussion was so open at this point that even the classroom itself at Peking University became a place where for the first time students and professors could discuss these issues in the classroom. Also, there was a kind of a underground publishing market that existed at that time. These were books that were unlawfully published with no censorship and no official permission. But there were these book stalls, they call them shutar, these outdoor book stalls, where you could get these underground books that were printed, overnight practically, and are very low quality. But suddenly at these book stalls, there were dozens, maybe, hundreds of magazines and books exploring these issues. Where should China go? So it's hard to imagine that now because at this point, you can't imagine in Chinese society now anything like this happening. It would have been cut off and stifled from the very beginning. But this was the reality in the 1986, 87, 88. This kind of openness that we haven't seen since then, and who knows, probably we'll never see again. So it was really an amazing time, and for academia, it was very giddy and exciting for the friends of mine who were students there.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, the mid late 80s were such a wild time in China, and it's if I'm this I've never seen it myself. I was just being born in that time period, but if I read about it, I can clearly tell this was a very different China, a China that's almost unimaginable from the current circumstances. David, just before I go on, I just want to let you know that Mark is going to restart your videos. I don't really know how that works, because apparently you're frozen. You're audible, but your face is frozen on the screen. So we're just gonna make your face move again. And we're having some more technical difficulties, but it has to do with your bandwidth. But anyway, to get back to the topic, so we are in the late 80s. Yeah, I can hear you. Don't worry. Oh yeah, that's great. So we're in the late 80s. It's a wild time. It's the leadership itself is discussing this, is screening and discussing this documentary series. Zhao Ziyang is watching it together, I believe in Zhongnanhai, with the paralyzed son of Deng Xiaoping, and he is very adamant that it should not be censored by the state. In the end, they released the entire 6-part series in June. The China Daily publishes the transcript, but still people are very uncomfortable about it. Politicians are intervening, and in August, after a lot of discussion, they decide to again show the documentary series, but now in a slightly censored format. I don't know how I don't know how you censor River Elegy, because the whole thing is rather outrageous. I mean, you mentioned, David, that it was very aligned with the reform movement, of course, but with Zhao's vision of the reform movement. There were other people in the Dengist reform movement who probably thought this was going too wild, because the official slogan of Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up is, we're still socialist. Capitalism is still kind of bad. Entrepreneurs are not in the Communist Party yet. That happens later. But we do want to be pragmatic, and we're also not going to fully dismiss Mao Zedong, but we are going to mention that he made a few mistakes here and there. So that was the official line, and then by absolutely rejecting all the socialist icons and implying that Mao is a river guy, and then arguing that we should embrace capitalism. Not socialism with Chinese characteristics, but capitalism is quite something. So it's really radical. How did it fit in the era and with the reform era? Because it's really a radical position within the reform movement at the time, right?
Well, by the reform movement, do you mean the party reform movement?
Yeah, I mean the Dengist. So you have the Dengist project, but within that, so you have people who want to reform and open up, and people are aligned with the project. But what is the project?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, you're right. That's a very good point. So Deng Xiaoping was really all about economic development, rising standards of living. Right. He was not all in for and within the bounds of what could still be called something like socialism and Marxism. But the River Elegy intellectuals, reformers, that was not good enough. They wanted the economic reforms to be more drastic, but then there was another element missing, and that was the other part of the May 4th demand, which is democracy, freedom and democracy. You may remember at the time in the 80s, there was an electrician named Wei Jingsheng who was part of the democracy wall movement. I don't know if people know about that. There was a wall in the Xidan area of Beijing that was just a kind of a blank wall from a factory or something, and people began to post, like just stick pieces of paper up with poetry and handwritten articles, complaints, banners, and different things that were complaining about some of the excesses of the reforms and also complaining about the previous Cultural Revolution. In fact, there was a whole genre of literature called scar literature, where people could actually write about their treatment during the Cultural Revolution. But this electrician was someone who was writing notes and putting it on the democracy wall, calling for the fifth modernization. And of course, back then the party had something called the four modernizations, which, oh my God, I'm not going to be able to remember what they are. Agriculture, industry, and science, I think. And help me out, Eric. What's the fourth?
Well, I would. That's also where I get stuck. Yeah, it's science,
defense, agriculture, industry, science, and technology and defense, or something like that. So Wei Jingsheng was saying no. Yes, but you need a fifth modernization, and that is, we want democracy. We want the vote. And by the way, this is all happening at the same time. The 80s is so packed with these incredibly politically volatile, issues. If you remember, in 1989, right when the Tiananmen Square protests were going on, that Gorbachev visited visited Beijing, and was greeted as a hero. In fact, people were cursing Deng Xiaoping and praising Gorbachev. Why? Because Gorbachev had not only undertaken perestroika, which is sort of like the Deng kinds of economic reforms, but also glasnost was the other piece of the reforms, which would be something like, I guess you translate it as openness, or transparency, or something like that. And so the demands were, you aren't going far enough. It's one thing to raise standards of living, but what we want is the full package. We want the full markets, and we also wanted the freedom to have some role in governmental decisions, and we want the vote eventually. They weren't stupid enough to think they were going to get it overnight, but they wanted the government to move in that direction. Yeah.
Yeah, no, but little did they know that they were actually at the glasnost moment, the peak of the glasnost in modern Chinese history. Because to be a bit cynical here, there was actually a democracy rule, if I'm not mistaken, earlier in Chinese history during the Let the 100 Flowers Bloom campaign in the 50s. And the people who put...
it wasn't a wall, exactly. It was just Mao, said, go ahead and write. It wasn't a wall.
Oh, okay. I thought, yeah, but people were hanging up big posters, and it had a bit of that spirit. But then, of course, it ended in a repressive campaign where many of the critics that had spoken out were sidelined and purged. So it's a the 80s is wild and vibrant, but also deeply tragic. Because we're moving towards 1989 and the repression, and the eventual oppression of those, the clench down on those protests. Su is actually who co-produced the River Elegy, was actually one of the organizers of the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989. So perhaps you could briefly touch upon the River Elegy 1989 link before we move on.
Well, of course, these River Elegy intellectuals were out, post 1989 or even before the actual massacre, but just the protests. That, of course, the hardliners were blaming Xu Xiaokang and these intellectuals for sort of fomenting these protests. And of course, obviously that was part of it, for sure. I think, if you look at the River Elegy, one of the chapters, I think, is actually devoted to the intelligentsia, the academicians and the intelligentsia. And one of their calls was for greater respect and more government involvement with the intelligentsia, these people that, in fact, the River Elegy sort of wears this kind of elitism on its sleeve.
Oh, yeah.
It's very clear that they thought, one of the tragedies of Chinese history is that the leaders and the emperors didn't value the intellectuals enough. And there's even some kind of almost insulting images of ordinary people, farmers and people who are uneducated, of lacking suzhi, this personal character that was a big thing, back then. And even now people will say the Chinese people don't have suzhi, I remember one of the most embarrassing quotes in the documentary is they're talking about how great the intellectuals were and how they could have saved the country. And this I can't quote it exactly, but it's something like, "Oh, if only the intellectuals could have sprinkled the sweet spring water of science and democracy onto the yellow soil," which is like, what a self-serving, thing to say. But anyway, yes. So that yes, these people were thought of and seen as the cause of these protests. But you have to look at the zeitgeist of China in the 80s. Deng Xiaoping had done this himself by opening up the society. His phrases, his slogans were "black cat, white cat, as long as it catches a mouse, it's a good cat," which means we're not going to, prioritize politics. In fact, his most, I think, a more important phrase is he said, "发展是硬道理," which you can translate as "development is the most important. Development is the ironclad priority," which is saying, look, everyone getting involved here, we will not make you a political enemy if you criticize or you come up with some constructive criticism on what to do, right? So it's also amazing to me at that time that the Ministry of Propaganda, whose name I can't remember, Zhu something, the propaganda department's slogan under his tenure was Quan Ho, Quan Rong, and Quan something, Quan Song. Quan Song. So it was generosity, tolerance, and relaxation. Can you imagine the propaganda ministry having that as its slogan now? Tolerance, generosity, it's crazy. So yes, and not only that, I mean, another thing that's very important is that the Tiananmen Square protests were not the first. A lot of people don't know that. They sort of think, 1989, suddenly these protests broke out. That's not true. Back in 1986 and 87, there were student protests throughout China. Well, not all through China, but at several universities, mostly about corruption and inflation, and also wealth inequality that was happening. So, yeah, I mean, the question was sort of at the time, are all these people, these intellectuals that are doing this in this documentary, are they reformers or are they rebels? And I think that the decision, when Zhao Ziyang was in power, he said, "Oh, don't worry, they're just reformers." But when 1989 hit, they became rebels. And then they were illegal, and then they were cracked down on, had to leave.
So I'm just, I wanted to get back to this praise of intellectuals and this implied elitism in River Elegy and more generally in the reform movement, because it is too just a little bit too juicy not to mention. I mean, you mentioned suzhi, by the way. So suzhi, the human quality, which is a very hierarchizing notion. It implies that humans are somewhere in a ranking, in a hierarchy, in a general way. So their moral, intellectual, cultural, educational qualities are somehow form a coherent whole. And then somehow, in terms of overall quality, they're somewhere in the chain. And this is actually suzhi. It's an older word, and Professor Andrew Kipnis, writes about this in a 2006 essay. It's an older word that was actually not used for people to describe their quality. It's actually only in the Reform era, it's only in the 80s that they start using suzhi as a general notion. So there's a kind of hidden elitism to the Reform era. And to give you a really awkward quote that even ventures into eugenics, from River Elegy, here we go, because eugenics was also still a big movement at the time. I think it's now, I don't think it is in contemporary China, but it used to be. So here we go. Quote, among the peasants in the far-flung backward villages, the enterprise is weak, the ability to take risks is low, and fatalism is strong. So you have the implied is the ideal of the entrepreneur, but instead we have these backward people in the villages, right? So I continue. No wonder some scholars sigh with regret that given these qualities, Suzhi, never mind the many restrictions, even if the great Lord Keynes were to come back to life, he could do nothing. It isn't the scarce resources, the low output or sluggishness, but the low quality, Suzhi, of the people. That is the essence of backwardness. The decline in the quality of the people results precisely from the rapid rise in population. Now here it gets a little bit eugenics-like. Huh? This is the vicious cycle of an agricultural society. Why do we still admire it? End of quote. And then you see a video image of ordinary, male workers, and in one image you see a person making a bit of a stupid face. So the implication is, look at these really stupid people.
That left a very big impression on me, with the yellowed teeth and sort of looking like an idiot or something. Yeah, it was very disturbing.
So so we've socialism always had the pretense that it was there for the villagers, and during the Cultural Revolution, people were sent to those villages to learn. Educated people were sent there. Now it's completely the reverse. You have nothing to learn from these villages. We need to get away from that, get these people out of that life, and learn from the intellectuals, learn from the West, please. Everything go and move in the opposite direction, please. On that,
I should though mention, Eric, that the term Suzhi has been kind of sort of reformed a bit, because now when they talk about Suzhi Jiaoyu, the Suzhi education, it's more like it now just means good citizenship, really. So it's kind of lost a little of that in the 80s, that sort of somewhat racist or geneticist sort of. Yeah. Now it's just kind of a harmless phrase that means being a good citizen. But yeah, anyway, you're right about that during the time, yes.
Yeah, certainly. I think that part of that eugenics, very harsh, very hierarchical side of China has been lessening a bit. It's no longer politically correct, I believe, also because the notion is a common prosperity. So, but you mentioned May 4th, and May 4th as a source or a predecessor to River Elegy. So let me go into the May 4th a little bit. So May 4th, just for the audience, and here I'm going to monologue slightly, very embarrassingly. So May 4th was a protest in 1919, which was nationalist and or national emancipatory, where you had students coming out and saying, the direct incident which they were responding to was Qingdao, which was previously a German colony, had been given to, parts of it had been given to the Japanese in Versailles. And in 1919, the students went out in China and they said, this is ridiculous. Our country is being bullied. We cannot defend ourselves. Something needs to change. So it was on the one hand a protest against bullying Western powers, colonial powers, and Japan, and increasingly imperialistic Japan. But at the same time, it was saying, in order to guard against those powers, we need to ourselves go through this process of nation building, and our cultural traditions, especially Confucianism, are standing in the way. Now, of course, with a protest movement, it's a little bit diffuse. It's not like a documentary. So there are the different factions within May 4th, so to speak. But it's really the birth pang of this harsh, scathing, anti-traditionalist cultural criticism, whereas previously there were some predecessors, but there was a notion we're going to maintain our Chinese civilization and just learn from the West to strengthen our civilizational core. But that was the May 4th rejected that, become more radical, more anti-traditional, more anti-Confucian. And interestingly enough, you get a very complex relationships with Chinese Communist Party history, because the Communist Party was founded in 1921, just 2 years after May 4th. And the original founders, many of which were influenced deeply by May 4th ideology. So the Communist Party was not, something radically different, but something that was close to it, proximate to the May 4th spirit. But then in later periods, there were rectification campaigns initiated by Mao, first in Yan'an, and then later after the People's Republic's founding, in the anti-rightist campaign, where they went after the lingering the liberal bourgeois, supposedly May 4th intellectuals. But also during the Maoist time, there were sort of May 4th incidents. During the Cultural Revolution, they went after the Four Olds and after the tradition. And it was a bit, this from the Western point of view, Western commentators often put the Cultural Revolution of Mao in a completely different box. That's totalitarian and evil. And then May 4th is emancipatory and hopeful and forward-looking, right? That's a very dominant frame. But there's actually during the Cultural Revolution, there was a bit of a May 4th rebelliousness. They hung, for example, they went to the family tomb of the Confucian of the Confucian family, the Kong family, and they hung some of the skeletons upside down from trees, just to signal we've really broken. We have no respect anymore for the Confucian tradition. And then during the Reform era, after Mao was dead, Deng Xiaoping came on the scene. There was, with something like River Elegy, a certain May 4th revival. So in different forms, this May 4th spirit has been coming back. And the communist ideology and the Communist Party has always maintained this very contradictory and complex relation to it. But I just wanted to ask you, David, if we put River Elegy in this longer tradition going back to May 4th, is there something? What is it about River Elegy? What idiosyncrasy? What era-specific particularity are we overlooking if we reduce it to another instance of this tradition?
Well, you ask really simple questions. I think that's a very, you're right. It's a very, very complicated question, especially the parties, changing over the years. The things that are in common are much easier to identify for the May 4th as well as the River Elegy intellectuals. The plea is for the plight is very existential. It's that they're worried that Chinese culture itself is going to be subsumed by the West. That there's a broad general agreement with the diagnosis, in the party included, but the final goal, the utopian vision, could differ and changed over the years. For May 4th, the final vision was something like a China patterned on a kind of a Western democratic state. The May 4th movement had less emphasis on economic systems than the River Elegy people, especially since there was a kind of a default readjustment toward capitalism after the fall of the Qing. I mean, what else was there to do? By contrast, River Elegy is highly focused on economics, markets, and capitalism, as you know, since you've seen it, and the tools that made Western countries rich. But confusion sort of arises because the party is a moving target. As you say, the rectification campaigns were meant to sort of erase some of those legacies of the May 4th movement, some of them being individualism and freedom, which was no longer palatable for Mao. But Confucius is a great example. It's great to use Confucius as an example because it's an example of this, as you say, this complicated stance towards Confucius. Mao and his cohorts were very much in the legacy of May 4th, so they hated Confucius, of course. No surprise there. They were just being good, May 4th legacy people. But you notice that the River Elegy hardly even mentions Confucius, although you can assume it's in the mix there because it's part of the old society, of course.
It's in the river. It's in the river somewhere in that. It's
in there somewhere, yeah. But it's certainly not the villain that it was for Mao. I mean, he was saying, Xi Jinping, criticized Confucius and Lin Biao, right? But what's interesting, Eric, is that after the 1980s, well, even in the 1980s, the party also began to shift its attitudes towards Confucius, even after Mao had vilified Confucius. And so the party began to, even before 1988, had begun to allow Confucianism to be studied academically. They allowed conferences on the study of Confucianism for the first time. And one of the reasons for that is the changing times, that a lot of people were returning to religion as the society opened up. The state administration of religious affairs became more important because, with the opening and reform and opening, people were getting back into Buddhism, back into Christianity. And what was interesting is that they sort of perceived that Marxism, Leninism, and Mao Zedong thought had left a kind of moral vacuum in the public, because there's nothing in those precepts to talk about outright morality. It's all about politically correctness, to have the right political ideology. What does it tell us about morals? So the government began to realize that there was a need, the public sort of needed something like a moral compass. And Confucianism was actually attractive because it was not a religion. It was an indigenous value system. And it was all about hierarchy, obeying authority, and harmony, which is that jives perfectly with what the party wanted. So even after all of that, the May 4th and then the vilification during the Mao, the Chinese society, or the Chinese party, began to bring Confucius back in. And as you know now, he's completely back in because of
Yes.
the study of things overseas of Chinese culture are called the Confucius Institutes, and the high-speed trains are called the Hexie. Harmony, number one, was this Confucianist value, right? So it's very interesting that it's very hard to answer your question because the party itself evolves very pragmatically while keeping the nomenclature the same. And so it's very tricky to answer the question. And I don't think I've answered it very well. It's a very good question. I don't think I can answer it.
Well, I think actually you did answer it by stressing that the economics and the capitalism was at the forefront. I don't think May 4th was a march for capitalism, whereas River Elegy is very much focused on that, on an industrialization, industrial modernity. So that brings us to the present, because on May 4th, a lot of the May 4th legacy has been marginalized, perhaps even because especially its criticisms of its downright rejection of Confucianism. Although, of course, contemporary readings of Confucianisms tend to be very politicized and hence selective, but which is unavoidable.
I'm sorry. Are you talking about the May 4th movement back in?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Now it's just talking. Yeah, now it's just talking about May 4th being having lost its legacy, having lost a lot of power as we move from the 80s from the mid and early 20th century up to the present. But River Elegy perhaps had something of a similar fate. But that's why I wanted to ask a bit, because I do think that there's a lingering presence of the spirit of River Elegy in China. So that's why I wanted to ask you: have you met the River Elegy type, so to speak, in all your engagement with students for the years? So I have sometimes come across something like this, the iconoclastic River Elegy spirit in some of the Chinese people I've interacted with. So I was wondering about your experience and your assessment as to how much of a presence it has in contemporary China.
Yeah, this is a really, really good question, actually. I think one big difference is that the existential question is no longer there for either one. So, as I said before, for the May 4th movement, it was an existential question because China had fallen into humiliation after the fall of the Qing, and then of course in the 80s it was the same sort of problem. I think that is no longer part of the modern sort of version of River Elegy type thinking. There's no chance that China is going to be subsumed by Western cultures anytime soon. So that's not an issue. One difference, of course, now in the social structure and the political structure is in the 80s, these debates were open for a short time, albeit for a short time. Now, any debate that's going on is not in the public. So it takes on a very different form when it's not publicly aired and debated, and when it's just only followed along, well, nowadays on the internet, but just the people-to-people conversations. And also the argument now is not about markets and capitalism either. Well, capitalism perhaps, but basically I think that argument's gone away too, because markets, Chinese, has mastered the art of markets to create wealth, and they have definitely adopted some kind of capitalism, even though the nomenclature always remains, socialism with Chinese characteristics. So that's not an issue either. But so what I think whereas the River Elegy legacy survives is in that other aspect that Wei Zhisheng was calling democracy. But really, it's a matter of freedom, and not just freedom of the vote or freedom politically, but spiritually freedom. I think that's a huge issue. When I hear River Elegy type of critiques against Chinese culture right now, Chinese politics, it usually is in that domain. It's that the party is stifling creativity. It's stifling individualism. It's crippling its own soft power because it won't allow the free imaginations and explorations of creative artists to take to play out, right? This is the kind of thing you hear. They censor the internet. They won't allow ideas from outside and so forth. I mean, a lot of people don't know this, but it's estimated, and these are pretty valuable, reliable estimates. There may be as many as 100 million people in China using VPNs to jump over the Great Firewall. And a lot of those people, maybe the majority, are just playing games and downloading porno or something like that. But I think a lot of them are searching for this thing that the River Elegy people were talking about, that is more like releasing the creative imaginations of Chinese people, letting them see what's out there and letting it influence them, and letting them build something that's Chinese and new and valuable on the basis, of that space that opens up. That's what I hear. And I think when I think of River Elegy now, I think of those kind of arguments because it's very much in the same vein. It's not so much just about economic freedom and material wealth. It's about spiritual wealth and intellectual and creative, artistic freedom is really what it's about. So that's my answer to that. I don't know what do you think? What do you hear?
I think you said that very beautifully, and you get right to the sad side of the contemporary Chinese condition. There's a bit of a sadness to contemporary China because it lacks that openness and that confidence. We have the political rhetoric of China attaining cultural self-confidence, but is the party confident enough to allow its people to flourish and have mobility internationally? Is it courageous enough to actually get into those artistic, intellectual, political arenas? I mean, it's a lot of things, as you mentioned, a lot of things have stifled. So all discussions have ended. There seems to be a kind of intellectual life, political thought seems to be overall dominated by the state-sanctioned hybrid of Marxism-Leninism and Confucianism. But it's not original Confucianism. It's not imperial Confucianism. It's a particular readings of Confucius, and then the Marxist-Leninist side is not original Marxism-Leninism. It's not Maoism. It's not even the more reformed kind of socialism. It's really the Leninist party state apparatus as the center of political power, and that it's a little bit of a bleak combination, and it's state sanctioned, and people reproduce it en masse. But people also have, because it also seems to have, at least the political elites seems to have great confidence in it, and this is why Kaiser Kuo, who you used to run a podcast with, and who I who I've met in Beijing many years ago. And when I met you, I met Kaiser. Kaiser Kuo wrote on his Substack. And Kaiser's a well-known China watcher for the listeners. He wrote recently on his Substack that modern Chinese history has ended, because modern Chinese history was always about this search for how, as you mentioned, scrambling to stay alive, right? Like how do we face up to the world? How do we face up to modernity? And then there were different versions being discussed and different strategies. And now there seems to be an actual Chinese elite that believes that it has figured out its regime formula. And socially, and the new doctrine is socialism with Chinese characteristics for the new era. And in this new spirit, there is this searching element of Chinese modernity has ended, and there doesn't seem to be, at least on the level of officialdom, there doesn't seem to be much room for anything even approaching the River Elegy kind of spirit, because China has, you could call it perhaps a bit of a chauvinistic phase even. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I certainly agree with Kaiser. He's a very smart guy. He knows what he's talking about. And he's certainly right about that. So in a way, the debate about reforming China's system, I would say now doesn't seem like a live option to anyone. Nothing is going to change this basic governance structure. It's been decided, but that doesn't mean there is no change. If you look what's happening, there are constant revisions and tweaking of the governance model, but they cleverly keep the terminology pretty much intact to give a sense of continuity, of complete continuity, or just only improvement. But the fact that you have to keep adding on, to add to socialism with Chinese characteristics. Now it's Xi Jinping thought in a new era of socialism with Chinese characteristics. So, it's the same thing, but it's not the same thing. They've added things to it. And by the way, this is another interesting thing. Again, talking about revising, not the governance model necessarily, but there's this potential now. There's this attempt now by the party to combine or blend Marxism and Confucianism, as you were kind of alluding to earlier, to actually blend those two together as being the sort of ipso facto explanation or rubric for the way China is the principles by which China operates. So the Confucianism being more the ethical, moral one, and Marxism being the political one. And there's even a name for this. They call it the two combines, is what the translation. We want to combine Marxism and Confucianism, which is pretty funny because the Marxists, as we say, the people who promulgated Marxism in the early part of the century hated Confucius, and yet now they're blending the two and saying, really, they're the same thing, or we can put those two together as a kind of a what's the word? kind of a linking, a kind of stitching it together so that they both form a kind of a coherent whole. It's actually very incoherent, I think, but this is what they're trying to do. So these kinds of changes take place. But Kaiser is certainly right that the basic thrust and the basic sort of trajectory of the governance model is not going to change perceptibly in the near future. So that debate might be still going on, but it's kind of a moot point because it's not going to change.
Yeah. Well, of course, China is a country that still has, within the political Communist Party, there are discussions and there's tweaking, and of course, the culture is always evolving. Countries change; nothing is frozen in time. But this kind of desperate search and the sense of alarm that China was behind modernity has disappeared. But in personal conversations, I think the radical critiques of Chinese culture and education still sporadically sprout up. And I do think it's important also as a historical fact that these kind of radical, scathing, even hyperbolic cultural criticisms have been important in Chinese history and even in Chinese Communist Party history. So, and I believe, and I wonder what you feel about this, that this has been completely overlooked by Western commentators. So Western commentators like Neil Ferguson, whose 2011 documentary series Civilization, also a documentary series like River Elegy on television, Civilization, where he, in his first episode, criticizes China for its closed offness. He says the West has these assets which I'm going to lay out in this series, but first look at what the opposite of Western innovation and dynamism is. It's this frozen Chinese imperial history, and then of course he goes to he touches upon the story of Admiral Zheng, who in the 15th century sailed out, but then instead of colonizing things, as you know, a good British person knows that a good Dutch person knows that if you sail somewhere, you have to colonize places. No, he doesn't colonize places. He returns to China. How idiotic. Or the McCartney embassy, the British outreach, first diplomatic outreach in 1793, where they presented scientific objects and industrial objects to the Qianlong Emperor, and the Qianlong Emperor was supposedly ignorant and not impressed, although it was also the whole point of such a meeting in the Chinese tradition was that the emperor would give bigger gifts to the guests than vice versa. So they were not supposed to impress the emperor with anything, right? So there was a lot of cultural misunderstanding there. But these things, these cliched accounts of these events are used to paint this really River Elegy-like picture of Chinese history. And I think Western commentators do this without realizing that this mode of critique this is not something they came up with, right? This is actually all over modern Chinese history.
Yeah, well, you're talking about foreign commentators, right?
Yeah.
I think you're right. I mean, I think the debate has been more obvious at different times. I mean, during the early 20th century, during the Chinese Civil War, foreign China watchers really could see that there was a fork in the road, and there was a lot of hand-wringing and theorizing and opinions about where China should go. And should they go nationalist? Should we go communist? How should it? So there was a lot of very open debate then. And I think after 1949, when Mao took power, China became very closed off. So in a certain sense, there was no visible debate within China for outside China watchers. China was a black box that appeared from the outside to be in just total unity and total consensus. And visitors who went there sort of saw that because that was what they wanted us to see. The real exception to that is the 1980s when the River Elegy phenomenon occurred. That was really the only time since the Mao period that anything like that happened, and now we're sort of back in a different world. But there's also another problem that you didn't mention, and that is which China are we talking about? Because, there are a lot of diaspora out there, are a lot of China watchers who are Chinese but are no longer in China, or who have long ago left one of the Chinas, whether it be Hong Kong, whatever. That's very politically incorrect thing to say, but there are lots of opinions that gets aired all over outside of China about China, but that comes from different people with different Chinese heritages and different backgrounds and different historical perspectives. So, I think there's enough information out there, and you obviously had it because you were just saying you had a sense of in private conversations.
Yeah, but you need those private conversations. It's very easy to miss it. I mean, you need them because I've heard many people say, people don't have any personal connections to China. I've heard them say, "Isn't China like the Borg?" So the Borg is this. I'm not sure. I think it's a Star Trek reference. It's supposedly this big collectivist monster in which no one thinks critically, and this is a real image that people have of China. And they don't have any knowledge no awareness whatsoever that there are these Chinese critical traditions, and that they can actually be, extremely radical and radical to an extent where they wouldn't even have an American equivalent.
Yeah. No, you're so right. You've been here, so you understand. But I mean, if you don't have to make very many friends here to figure out that there is an enormous range of opinion here. It's enormous and very varied and very diverse, and someone is very strongly held. So yeah, absolutely. I think that's kind of invisible to most so-called China watchers who don't really know that much about China. They're more like China opinionators. They're not really watchers. They don't know what they're watching. But no, I think you're exactly right. The people, writers in the West, especially journalists, very often don't really get a sense of the depth and variety of opinions in this country. You're exactly right about that.
David, thanks so much. We have an audience that's very eager to join in, so we're going to move to the Q&A. And first, Beth Bader, who's the former head of the Beijing Chicago Center. So we had this great Chicago Center just in Renmin. Have you been? Have you been to the Chicago Center? Yeah. Okay.
That was way back then. I haven't been to it in a long time. It's still there. I don't know.
Yeah, she I think it's still there, but Beth has moved on to other things, and she asks, where can we watch it? So I watched I don't want to recommend it to anyone. I watched a really low quality version that I found on really some obscure website. So do you know, David? Do you know a good place to watch River Elegy online?
Yes, I can. The only place I've gotten the whole documentary is the Internet Archive. That has a truncated version of all 6 episodes. That's, I think, like half an hour a piece or something like that, with English subtitles, which is useful just to get the general idea if you don't speak Chinese. But there is a link to the entire 3 hours of the 6-part series that you can download, an MP4.
Someone put it. Mark put it in the chat. The link.
I can put it. I have the link. I don't know. I can give it. I can give it to you or something. You can.
No, I think Mark has just put it in the chat. So of this. And I also want to let everyone know that we're gonna, in the spirit of River Elegy, we're gonna do things a little bit different than with previous Q&As, where you just have to send in your questions and I read out your questions like an authoritarian dictator. We're moving towards the ocean, freedom, and democracy. So anyone can just join in and stay. You appear on the video and just jump in here with your question. So if you have a question, I don't know how that works, but just press on a button, say you want to ask your question, and you can also, if you rather not ask it in person, or you're like you're in your underwear, then just use the chat. But otherwise, you can just, if you want, you can just jump in here with your video if you're comfortable. You can. Mark says, raise your hand digitally or use the Q&A function. I hope people will just jump in and not be shy. I'm going through the written questions now. There's a lot of people here. Despite all the technical difficulties, there are quite some people. There's a new message. Joe, please join us. People just don't be shy. Just join the chat. Yeah, it's usually we have a larger audience than today because we had technical difficulties and apparently the wrong time was sent on the Eventbrite. It's like this is always a nightmare. Of course, luckily that didn't happen to us before, but regretfully it happened to us with this episode. So we have less people than we usually have. I see Mark Staalman appearing here. Please go ahead. And unmute yourself. Yeah, please go ahead. You're on mute still. Great.
I was fortunate enough to be invited and attended Second World Congress on Marxism at PKU. And I was there with friends. I don't speak Chinese. And they arranged for me to meet with a number of deans of schools of Marxism, which were the panel that I spent the most time with. And I also took the time to, at lunch, go to the Western Marxists who were invited, often as keynoters. And my observation was very simply, since I know a little bit about the subject, or maybe more than a little, what China's doing is not Marxism, and they know it. And the Westerners knew it. The Western Marxists uniformly had the view, when speaking with me, that they were not at all clear why they were invited. And this is not Marxism, they said. So something has transpired here where the Chinese characteristics are probably not so well understood unless you actually go to the event. There is a longstanding principle by me and my associates in studying this, that it's extremely difficult, even if you're fluent in language, to get clear answers to many of these questions. And so there's a kind of a closedness that's still there. So I'm wondering about these labels, Marxist, capitalist, socialist, and so forth, which have been discussed here, because I don't think any of them apply. There's something radically different going on, which has very little understanding in my observations in the West. So the question is...
You want me to?
Yeah, sure, thank you.
So there's a reason why they call it socialism with Chinese characteristics. And it is
Right.
confusing because again, it is your Marxist, Western Marxist friends are quite right. It's not Marxism in the way that Marx would approve of. So the nomenclature, though, is important. That's why socialism with Chinese characteristics. Now it's Xi Jinping thought about socialism kind of in the new era. These are all signal tweaks to the system and to the economic system and to the. What they will tell you is that socialism, Marxism, is not a static thing, that it can be revised, just as there are different forms of democracy. There can be different kinds of communism, socialism. You notice they don't use the word communism, and that's confusing to me. And when I've talked to TV editors and people that are translating media from different cultures or different countries that uses the word communism, and I was a sort of an advisor on Chinese TV for a time, and they said, "Can we say communism? Can we use that word?" And I said, "Well, you are a communist country, right?" And I said, "Well, but we usually use the word socialism." So I think it is intrinsically blurry. When Deng Xiaoping first began to enact these economic reforms, the party theorists were tied in knots to figure out how to talk about it and explain what it was and to name it. The huge arguments around the time that Deng was making these changes. Well, what do we call this? How do we justify it? How does it fit in with Marxism? And I think they never really came to a satisfactory explanation. And I think they kind of, I'm not an expert in this field at all, but I think they've kind of just given up and said, it is what it is. This is what we call it. It's our own model. They rightly say, it's our own model that we've developed. No one else in the world has it, and it wouldn't fit anywhere else. It fits us, and that's what we call it. So I think it's kind of a moot point, perhaps.
Well, it's the understanding of this model in the West when Westerners continue to use their versions of the vocabulary.
Right.
That I think is the real problem. It's the lack of an effort to fully understand how this is unique.
That's right.
If I may, let me add a addendum here to this. The most important thing that is happening has never been mentioned today, I think, and not mentioned perhaps in the other 3 sessions which I've listened to. And that is the radical changes that digital technology has made in all of our lives. The Chinese have approached digital technology in a very different way than the rest of the world. So I would suggest for those who are attempting to understand this unique, we don't know what to call it, Chinese model, that their approach to digital technology, executives of digital companies, the whole Jack Ma exercise, at one point driving him out of the country. He moved to Tokyo. I believe he's back now in China. The way that the Chinese party, Communist Party of China, and as we all know here, when somebody insists on calling it the CCP, they're probably not so ignorant as they are attempting to be insulting, because there is no CCP. There's a CPC, as they call it themselves, Communist Party of China. They changed the name of the party when they took over. And so you'll see this distinction. But the CPC's approach to digital technology is unique. I'm sorry, I'm Mark Stallman. I run something called the Center for the Study of Digital Life. My partner in forming this has been spending half of his life in China for nearly 40 years. He knows so much more about it than I do, but he's been back 5 times since the COVID lockdown was lifted. And so I get fairly significant internal reporting. The way that the West deals with digital, Europe is obviously different from North America and so forth. So, but it tends to be a regulatory sort of approach. That is not the Chinese approach at all. The CPC has wholeheartedly taken this on in phrases like ubiquitous society and so forth. The integration of financial and educational and governmental relationships all into single platforms. This is unique, and it's a very important part of that model that needs to be understood. I'm wondering if you've had a chance to think about that much.
Yeah. Of course, I more like live in it and feel it more than I think about it, because I have to grapple with the Chinese internet. But no, I mean, you're right that they have, contrary to expectations, they have embraced digital technology, including internet technology, and revolutionized. I mean, the saying about 10 years ago was, we were hoping the internet would change China, but it turns out China has changed the internet.
Right. Right.
You know much more about this than I do, so I don't have anything to add to what you said. But I understand what you're talking about, and it is quite an amazing development, which is we have not seen the end of it.
Can I just tie this back to River Elegy by saying that actually this kind of opening to the world under the direction of the party, so that the internet is like the ocean in River Elegy, right? It's this wide world. So originally, the West looked at China in this more River Elegy kind of way, where we thought the ocean is going to flood China, the internet will change China, and then instead China changed the internet. So in a sense, there is now it's kind of breaking the River Elegy mold, so to speak, because in the River Elegy mold, you would have China would have opened up to the sea. And that but now it's and it would be like freedom and democracy flourishing and the central state maybe taking the back seat. Now it is so China is reaching it's integrating with globalization via the internet and in other ways in a way that was previously not conceivable. It doesn't fit the mold of River Elegy, which contrasts agricultural, stagnating, closed societies with open, globalizing societies. And there's no room there for the kind of China that we have nowadays, which is globalizing, but under the strict guidance of a Leninist party state.
I'll conclude. Somebody else just joined the panel with following observation. My first trip to China was in 1997 at the invitation of my partner here at the center. And the Chinese wanted to hire me to help with their digital plans. So there was no Great Wall yet. I wasn't being asked to come in and help them to design the Great Wall. I was being asked to bring in Western companies to participate in this process. And I was being promised some 5% or something of business that would be generated. And I declined that offer and said, no, you could pay me straight out as a consultant. But aside from that business practice, I would just conclude by saying, if I knew this in 1997, a lot of other people should have known this in 1997. So the failure of the West to understand what's been going on now for almost 30 years in this regard, I find discouraging. And I'm hopeful that TPPI, maybe I'll make a recommendation, suggestion for the conference to come in and talk about this. But I think the West really has to step up to understanding China and the digital revolution.
So we have Joseph. Thanks, Mark. We have Joseph Murphy in the chat, but we also have in the room. But we also have a question in the chat. Maybe I'll just throw that in real quick before we turn to Joseph Murphy. The question is, I'd be interested to know more about how much people talk about River Elegy in common political discourse even today. I'm not a China hand. If I go to China and use River Elegy as a stand-in for concept, will people know what I'm talking about? How live is it still? David, how would you respond to this? I'm not sure who asked it, by the way, but please continue. I'm not sure who the person is who asked this, but it's an anonymous question, so to speak. Yeah.
No, I think people of that generation, so in other words, people about my age probably, will know of it and will have maybe even seen it. I think if you're talking to anyone under, I don't know, 50, 45, 40 years old, I don't think it's not in the discourse. It really is not. Nobody really knows much about it. Which the fact that people have to ask, where is it? Where can I find it? Means it's not talked about much. It kind of fell by the wayside, partly because it was such a fixture, or it was such a phenomenon of those times, and I think it's only interesting in that standpoint. It didn't have any follow up. It didn't have any repercussions. It was sort of nipped in the bud there, So I mean, it's very interesting historically, but I don't think anyone, my students, would know of it, or anyone younger than I am would know it.
I just got a little elbow from Mark Weiner, who says that in introducing Joseph Murphy, I should say that Joseph is a major bridge between literary studies between Asia and America, and Joseph edits a significant journal. So with that, please go ahead, Joseph.
Hi. Yeah, well, we used to edit the journal. I'm a professor in the English department at Furen Catholic University in Taipei. Mark twisted my arm to join you. I just happily stumbled upon this great discussion. I have not watched the film River Elegy, but one question that comes to mind for me is a major topic of conversation these days in the U.S. Is hillbilly elegy, right? And I'm just kind of thinking about the role that elegy plays in countries as they modernize but struggle with the transition between the past and the future. And I just was wondering if you have any comments on more broadly on the role of elegy as a literary or filmic form. If anyone has a meditation on that, it's just a question that comes to mind.
Well, it's an interesting question. I think the official translation, actually, of the Chinese name, which is He Shang. He means river. Shang is what they use for elegy. But Shang has connotations of tragedy, and mourning is almost like it. Not even elegy, but mourning. I think the official translation is a death song of the river, which the river being the traditional Chinese culture, but it is a very evocative word in English. I think elegy is probably better. Death song doesn't really mean much to us, but I think elegy is probably the right word. I don't know. You're a literature professor.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that in both cases, the elegy is a very powerful political form. In fact, is creating this political destiny here in the U.S., but is also something that, there's a discussion now that J.D. Vance, the author of Hillbilly Elegy, has sort of turned his back on the thesis of his book, which was actually blaming hillbillies themselves for not sort of pulling themselves up by the bootstraps as he did. And, he's joined a more Trumpian explanation of the whole thing. Maybe I could shift gears Mark is actually not correct that I'm an expert on Asia in any sense, but I am insofar as I've lived in Taiwan for many years, and I've taught American literature and Western civilization here to primarily Taiwanese students, but we get students from Europe. I've had students from Germany and France, but also we get students from mainland China. In the previous decade, we were getting a lot of students, and it was actually a great source of revenue for the university, but it was also great to have those students in class and for there to be dialogue between mainland Chinese and Taiwanese students. And that flow of mainlanders has really shut down. I mean, we get a few, and they're always very good students. And I can't say that the ones who come here are representative of mainland China in general, but they're definitely open. I mean, Taiwan actually has a certain cachet in China. I don't know if that gets talked about. I mean, it has cachet, as a political tool in China, of course. But I mean, just as a culture, they're fascinated with our culture. And certainly 10 years ago, there were a lot of students who wanted to come here. But that, sadly has changed, and things have frozen up, kind of on both sides. But I guess I'm wondering your thoughts about Taiwan and the modernization of China, and what role the Taiwan question plays in all of this. If you have any thoughts, it's of urgent interest to me.
Eric, you want to tackle that?
Oh, absolutely not. But I would say that if I would gonna interpret this from a River Elegy point of view, the mainlanders no longer being as eager as they used to in going towards Taiwan, apparently, it would be the river clogging up with silt. So that's and the sky blue ocean ever being further out of sight. But from that, that said, I now hope that's all I have, and I hope that David has a really good answer to that.
Oh, it's too big of an issue, as you probably know, Joseph. It's just horribly complicated,
Yeah,
it's a huge tragedy, and I've been to Taiwan many times. In fact, the first Chinese-speaking place I ever went to was Taipei, back before I went came to Beijing, and it's at this stage, it's sad to me. I'll just say this one thing: it's the separation and the political schism that's been these two that seems to be Taiwan is fated to go through is now, and you probably know this, the Taiwan education system is actually now cutting back or even just cutting off completely certain parts of the history curriculum to not go back to the Chinese roots, to talk about the dynasties and so forth, but to start the education, the Chinese history classes in Taiwan, to start with the founding or the beginning of the ROC, right? So in other words, the kids when they go to school will not learn about the history of China, they will learn about the history of Taiwan. And I have no objection to that. I mean, yeah, it makes some sense, but it just speaks to the tragedy of the whole thing, that the result of all these crises and all these separations since the tragic World War II incidents has left, a part of, I guess it's left pieces of this huge, amazing diaspora of Chinese influence and Chinese culture and plural cultures to be just sort of siphoned off, or what's the word, in their siloed off into different sort of cultural frameworks. It's very sad, but I mean, that's kind of what we're living. That the decision of the Taiwanese education system to do that is sort of a symptom of all those tragic schisms.
Yeah. Actually, I could go in the other room and ask my daughters, about what they have learned. I mean, I know that they do study Confucius and the ancient writers, and that's not only in history class but also in their Chinese language class. I mean, you're right that there's definitely been more emphasis on the history of Taiwan and on the Aboriginal cultures of Taiwan,
right,
which is all part of the larger question of trying to define Taiwanese identity, which I think is, very much dealing with a contradiction, because on the one hand, Taiwan claims to be, the place that proves that democracy and Chinese identity are reconcilable, but at the same time, you have this sort of turning the back on Chinese identity,
right.
So I mean, there's a kind of a contradiction there, actually. But I mean, as is the case in mainland China, there's a great diversity of opinions, and there are people, for example, like my wife, who's Taiwanese, who actually identifies more as Chinese culturally, but of course politically she identifies with Taiwan. So there's also that possibility. In other words, people who identify with China don't necessarily, by and large, don't want to reunite with China.
Right, and it also has to do with age. It has to do with how old you are too.
Right. Yeah. That's true.
So if I just can jump in to make the discussion even sadder, because the things that you discuss now about the schism between China and the mainland China and Taiwan is, of course, culturally a schism. If less personal, there was a time when at least cultural bridges are being built, perhaps less cultural bridges are being. So there's a lot of sadness in all of that. But I'm also very worried about the future because I've been reading up on my Xi Jinping thought. So as an amateurish reader of Xi Jinping thought, the central notion of Xi Jinping thought seems to be, apart from the Leninist party state being an absolute power in China, it seems to be territorial integrity. Or I should say the great restoration of the Chinese nation, and the central component of that is the territorial integrity. And then the central component of that is Taiwan. So if a certain reading, a paranoid reading perhaps, but it is my paranoid reading of Xi Jinping thought, is that it's basically telling us we're going to grab Taiwan. And I've also been reading, I'm doing the political thought webinar. I'm trying to read up on the contemporary Chinese essayists, and maybe I just read the really strident ones. But it seems to me that there is an extreme vilification of the West and a justification of a potential move on Taiwan, with notions such as China is bringing the world spirit of Chensha. China is representing Wangdao. Of course, all these concepts, Wangdao, Chensha, can also be used self-critically. It can be used in very subtle political discourses. But there are ways of using those concepts to say China is going to harmonize the world. China is going to bring the harmony, but there is the Badao of Western might just camping out there on Taiwan. And wouldn't it be great for everyone if the force of Badao would be pushed back a bit so harmony could reign? Because as Zhang Shigong, a law professor at Peking University, writes, first China needs to get its game in order, which means it needs to be reunified with Taiwan. Taiwan needs to be absorbed into the People's Republic. And from that basis on, it can harmonize Asia. And on the basis of a harmonious Asia, we can build a harmonious world. So if you read up on this, I'm thinking, okay, when are the boats going to sail? When is Taiwan going to fall? I mean, it looks very bleak. I mean, I don't know. Now that we're here in a political thought seminar and we're all the way at the end, maybe I can bring this in. It's like, I don't know how this is going to, how we're gonna save like the worst scenarios from occurring. Sorry for that, by the way. I'm frozen. No. I left on the bleakest note and then I dropped out. So sorry about that. yeah. You guys started with the Taiwan, so I was like, okay, now I'm gonna go all out.
Eric, I'll just report from what I know from all these visits and so forth with my partner, is that the general view that I'm absorbing is that there's no hurry. And this is particularly the case because globalism is over now. So digital technology has ended globalization, which is the thing that gets measured in terms of trade, as has been shown in op-eds in the New York Times and other places. But globalism, which is basically what Trump and what are called populists are against, is on the decline as well. So the overall change is something that I think that PRC, CPC, are now viewing this as time is on their side. It is notable here that perhaps the greatest asset of Taiwan are companies like TSMC. And so you might suggest that the mainland needs Taiwan in order to be technologically up to date, and that is categorically false. There are now, I don't know if people care about what are called nodes in semiconductor processing, but it turns out that the 5 and 4 nanometer nodes that China has already achieved internally, we now have headlines that the U.S. government is going to try to constrain foreign suppliers of semiconductor equipment. But the Chinese are they don't need TSMC. They're able to do it themselves. And so this drumbeat about marching on Taiwan is absolutely not the picture that I get from reporting inside the PRC. Eventually, yes. Right now, no need to do it.
Well, that's let's hope that. Well, okay. Well, postponing a nightmare scenario is not okay. It's a little bit, maybe there's some optimism in there. But I want Mark actually he gave me an elbow again. He says we're going to round up, and I wanted to ask David Moser for a final reflection on the continued relevance of something of the spirit of River Elegy. David, what are your last words on this?
Well, I guess I would say, and I should say this, I am definitely not a dragon slayer, not really a panda hugger either. I was someone who really wants China to succeed. I have a lot of, I love the culture, obviously. I love the language. I think there's a lot that Chinese culture and the Chinese people and the Chinese ways of living and thinking have a lot to offer us in the West. And I think it's good. I do think of myself as a bridge. So I think that the River Elegy, we're sort of lumping this all into just, harsh criticisms of Chinese culture. I think those, as Eric, you said, those sparks of criticism are still alive and they're ongoing, and China needs them, even though they don't allow them to be publicly aired. They're there, and they happen inside Zhongnanhai as well. So the arguments are going on, and as crises appear, then the arguments get more complicated and fiercer. So I'm all gung ho. Keep the spirit of River Elegy alive, because we need those arguments. We need those criticisms. We need those new ways of looking at things, and willingness to discard parts of Chinese culture that are destructive and keep those that are productive. So yeah, I mean, it's a good thing to go back and look at it. Everyone who hasn't seen it or interested in China should go back and watch at least some of the documentary and get a sense of the kind of freewheeling argumentation that was going on back then. And let's hope, I think that it was significant. It made a difference. And that it's, the questions that are raised are still open. I think we should still keep pursuing them. And that's because I actually love China, and I hope China can go on to be a powerful nation with a population, are as rich and free and alive as they could possibly be. So I guess summing up what Eric and I were talking about, that's pretty much how I feel. Yeah, River Elegy is worth listening to, and it's good, and it's still here.
Oh, that's very beautifully said, David. You love China, you wish the Chinese people well, and because we wish the Chinese people well, we wish them to have sparks of creativity and critical thought, because critical thought is going to be vital to their well-being going into the future. Wow, that's amazing. Thanks so much, David, and thanks everyone for joining despite the technical difficulties.